So, my name is Lisa. I'm from Saskatchewan, and I work with a group called the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council. So we're a small nonprofit. There's about 5 of us working there, and mostly what we do is we help cities and companies and individual people learn more about recycling and compost and other ways to keep stuff out of the garbage to decrease the kind of garbage that we're making. My job is mostly to talk about compost, so that's what I'm here to do today. Is this okay the way it is, or should we put the lights down?
For the video, I think we should put the lights
for the video, down. But for this part, can you guys see the screen okay? Is it all right? Or we could, okay, awesome. Yeah, so I've got some props and I've got some stuff to do, but I'm also going to spend some of the time just talking. If anything I say is raises a question, or if you just have a question, feel free at any point to interrupt me. That's no problem, especially in a small group. It gets a little crazy if there's like 40 people, but with 3 it's fine. So, what is compost? Compost is when we take organic waste, and by that I basically mean food waste and plant waste, and we turn it back into a kind of good soil, or technically a soil amendment. It's not complete soil, but let's just call it good soil. And I know it's probably something people are already pretty familiar with, at least with the concept, but I have some examples here of jars of things that are the kind of stuff that can go into compost, so I'm just going to bring these out. I guess I'm going to disappear from the video feed for a second, but that's okay, I'll be back. I know it's pretty obvious, but it's good to have examples still. Or is it possible to turn it to show me over here?
Yeah, I can.
Sorry, I'm talking about it too much.
There we go.
So I've got like sort of obvious things, like I have green plants and grass, things that can go in compost, and I have brown plants and leaves and sticks and all the woodier stuff. If it's a plant, it can go in the compost, so I've got those 2 things. Then I also have some food waste here. So I've got vegetables and fruits in here. I have some orange peels, I've got a banana peel, I've got some celery bits. But then I've also got stuff like an eggshell, or a tea bag, or a crust of bread. So all of these things are things that are made out of primarily plants. Stuff that's made out of dairy or meat we generally avoid, with the fun little exception, because nothing can ever be real simple, is that eggshells are also okay, even though they're from an animal. So I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then one part that some people don't know about is in here I've got some sort of bits of paper and like toothpicks, popsicle stick, a toilet paper roll, napkins from Subway, that kind of thing, and some newspaper. And so this kind of paper and wood bits can go in as well. If places have a recycling program, I know not everyone does, but if someone has a recycling program, the clean paper often goes in recycling, but paper that's dirty, got some food or some water or some grunge on it, can often go in the compost instead of the garbage still. So together, with a few months of time and a little tiny bit of work, these things will all change what they are. They will not be food and plants and paper anymore, and they'll turn into soil. So this is an example of some finished compost that's made out of the things in these jars. It'll just take a few months. And I will actually, this one, I'll just pass around for people to look at. Normally compost also has a nice earthy smell, like being out in a garden. This has been in a jar too long, so it mostly just smells like jar. But normally it would have a nice smell. So I'm gonna move back over here. All right. Thanks. So, we talked a little bit about what it is. So reasons that compost is important, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn. This is actually a big part of the presentation that I'm giving today, sort of what is the point of composting? Why do we do it? One thing is to make a lot less garbage, of course, that's a really straightforward one, but the other ones is to make less pollution in our landfills, and I'll talk about why that happens, because it's an interesting thing that not a lot of people know about. I'll talk about how it helps feed the soil's ecosystem, and even it is a good way to sequester carbon, grab some carbon, get it out of the air, stick it in the soil, and keep it there. And finally, for sort of a less of an environmental and more of a self-centered way, it makes the soil a lot better for growing plants. So if we're trying to grow vegetables, or flowers, or grain, or just anything, compost is a helper for that. Okay, so talking first about making less garbage. This is an example, it's a graphic, it's from Saskatchewan, but it's the numbers are kind of comparable for other communities. So they did a check in 2016. They looked at a few different people's, many people's garbage bins to sort of get a sense of like, what are we throwing out? What's actually in our garbage cans? And for one family in a house that didn't have a compost bin, so they were throwing all of that stuff out, they found that 58% of their garbage can just was food waste and plant waste. And that's not even like a peak from the summertime, that was an average for the whole year. So they realized, basically with those kinds of numbers, if people are able to divert that out of the garbage and put it into some sort of composting program instead, there's just a lot less garbage to deal with. And the garbage that is left isn't as smelly and isn't as heavy and isn't as wet, because all of that kind of moisture and all of that stuff that can rot has been taken out. So some examples of just what kind of things people are throwing away: bags of grass, of course, bags of leaves as well, and food waste, so little bits of scraps of vegetables and stuff. This would also count things like cooked food that's gone bad, or say somebody brought home a bag of lettuce and they didn't get around to making salad and it all turned brown, so that kind of thing as well. So here we have the landfill. So pretty, not very pretty. This is the second thing that I was going to talk about making less pollution. In a landfill, food and yard waste rot or putrefy in a way that makes a variety of kinds of pollution, the most important kind being methane, which is a greenhouse gas. It gets up into the air and contributes to climate change. It stays in the air less time than carbon dioxide on average, but it's a lot stronger. So it's sort of like a strong short-term effect. It stays up for a few decades, and it's I think about 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide, so it's pretty powerful. And it happens when we put food and yard waste in a landfill, and it doesn't in a compost pile, and I'm going to talk about why. Oh yeah, so another thing from the city of Saskatoon, they made this graphic to try to explain this concept to people. I haven't gone through the whole thing, but they realized that it was kind of hard to talk about the different chemical ways that things rot and have people understand them, but they thought people would pretty much understand a happy banana peel versus like a sad banana peel, so they were like, let's do it that way. So why doesn't that methane and pollution get made in a compost pile? The difference is oxygen. Back here, just gonna back up, in the landfill, everything that gets dropped off during the day then gets compacted by these heavy machinery driving over it on purpose. They squish it all down to make as much room as possible so they can fill up the landfill as slowly as possible. And then they cover it with something like some dirt or some gravel to hold it all in place at the end of the day. They call that clean fill. And the reason that this is done at a landfill is to make more space and to also make sure that none of this stuff blows around, basically. It keeps it all, it makes it stay put, which is really what the landfill is for. Unfortunately, that means that they pack all of the air out of it. So there's just no fresh air available in the pile of garbage at the landfill at all. Whereas in the compost pile, there's lots of air from the edges and in the middle because we don't squish it down the same way. And so because it has fresh air, it rots in a totally different way. And the reason for that, when there's oxygen available from the air, different microbes, different bacteria and fungus can stay alive. And so the food and the yard waste can break down in a totally different way. So the whole key is fresh air. When there's no air available, we call them swamp bacteria or anaerobic bacteria. Basically bacteria that don't need oxygen are the ones that have to take over, and they make things rot really, really slowly. Like a head of lettuce in a landfill could take 10 or 20 years to break down. And in the meantime, they make a lot of methane. But the ones that do like air, that live in a compost pile, it only takes them a few months, and they break down much cleaner, and they don't release that methane. So that's the big difference. Oh yeah, all right. So the third thing about sequestering carbon is that adding compost to a soil is a way to sequester carbon. There is carbon in the compost, so we've kind of stuck some in there, and then it goes back in the soil. But there's a really interesting thing that people have just been finding in like the last 10 or 20 years. It's mostly in the last few years, though, that they're really catching on to this, especially in land that's been part of like an industrial farming system for a long time. People haven't been super nice to the soil there. They almost sort of, you could think of it that they're sort of mining the organic matter out of the soil by growing the crops every year and not really giving stuff back. And it turns out that being more careful with our soil, not tilling it so much, doing a rotation of different crops, so there's different plants growing there, feeding the soil different things, and putting compost and organic matter back into the soil makes a huge difference for sequestering carbon. And I'm going to show a neat little video to talk about that. So do I need to turn up the volume, or we had kind of a silly workaround to make sure that you could hear the video. So I'm going to do a silly thing here, and I hope nobody minds. You good? All right. Oh, I heard a little feedback. Wait a minute. Oh, I know it's wrong.
That might just turn that hopelessness. Are we feeling a little hopeless about climate change and the damage we've done to our planet? Well, now there's a new way to look at climate change and how to deal with it. That might just turn that hopelessness into hope. Climate change, as we know, is all about too much carbon in our atmosphere. But carbon is not our enemy. It's the building block of life. Everything alive is made of it, even us. The problem and the solution are simply a matter of balance. Let's step back and look at the 5 pools where carbon is stored on planet Earth. Starting about 500 million years ago, when plants first appeared on land, carbon began to cycle in an amazing balance between these pools, a balance that allowed for life as we know it to evolve. Then one life form, that would be us, figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil pool, which was pretty much a timeout zone for carbon. We've been burning it for energy, putting it into play, and disrupting that balance. The way we manage land and do agriculture is moving even more carbon into the atmosphere. Specifically, we've moved 880 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating up the planet and destabilizing our climate. The oceans have absorbed a lot of this excess carbon, throwing off the ocean's balance, resulting in ocean acidification and accelerating a mass extinction of sea life. So in order to save life as we know it, of course we need to stop burning fossil carbon. The big question is, where do we put this excess carbon to get the cycle back in balance? The good news is that the answer is literally right under our feet. It's the soil. Plants, using sunlight and water, naturally perform photosynthesis. They pull carbon in from the air and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars. Then they pump some of these sugars down through the roots to feed microorganisms who use that carbon to build healthy soil. Voila, carbon moved. The plants pump it in, and the soil stores it. Nature's living technology is amazing. Scientists have recently discovered that applying a thin layer of compost can help regenerate healthy soil, setting up an ongoing feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year. Together with other regenerative practices like not tilling the soil, planting trees and cover crops, and planned grazing, we can build and retain billions of tons of soil carbon. This is carbon farming. This is regenerative agriculture. Unlike more carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the ground is good for us. It makes healthy soil, which is nutrient rich and full of life and holds way more water. This means more nutritious food and crops that are more resilient in the face of drought. That's good news for farmers, families, and everyone who eats. Remember this, the way we grow our food, fiber, and fuel either puts carbon up into our atmosphere or pulls it down into the ground. The regeneration of soil is the task of our generation. Our health, the health of our soils, and the health of our planet are one and the same. If you're like most people, you're probably feeling a little hopeless.
Are we back at an okay level? Okay. I know that was a little silly, but it was the best way we could find this morning. So that video gets a little emotional and bombastic, but it is right. A big part of the problem of what we've done in terms of carbon is that we've just sort of unbalanced where it's all being stored. So it's up in the air instead of in the soil and in the fossil fuels buried under the earth. And it is, I think, really cool that it turns out that we can take a bunch more carbon and stick it into the soil if we just take care of it right and add compost the way we should. It mentioned a little bit about how healthy soil is full of life. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that next, and that's going to tie into how adding compost makes the soil itself better for growing plants. So, what have I got here? Oh, okay. My PowerPoint looks a little different than I thought it did. So, what is soil? Soil is made up of rock dust, water, air, and organic matter. And it doesn't form very quickly on its own. It takes about 1,000 years if we're starting from rock. It takes about 1,000 years to form a centimeter of soil. If we're starting somewhere that already has established plants, it's a little faster. But just pure rock, it takes a long time. And so here's sort of the balance that we have in most soils. It varies a little from place to place, but it's about half rock dust, and then a quarter air, a quarter water, and then the little bit that's left over is organic matter. And that doesn't look like very much, but that 5% of organic matter is actually just really important to the way the soil acts. Yeah, that's very important. So, there's an ecosystem in the soil. Healthy soil isn't a dead thing, it's alive. This is another thing that sort of the mainstream agricultural scientists missed for about 150 years. There's somebody back in the 1800s who did a particular experiment, and he was like, I figured it out, all we need is chemicals. And then that's what they thought for about 100 years. And it's only recently they were like, maybe the ecosystem is also important. So we start with sort of the growing plants in the corner, and from their leaves and their roots, and from something called exudates, the sugars they spit out into the soil, we get this organic matter in the soil, and that's fed on by little tiny things like fungus and bacteria, which are, of course, then, as we've all seen, like the little fish that gets eaten by the bigger fish, gets eaten by the bigger fish in the food chain. The fungi and bacteria get fed on by bigger things like protozoa, which are slightly larger single-celled organisms, and nematodes, which are microscopic worms. And then we have arthropods. I love the word pods because it makes me sound so smart. It just means bugs. So we have bugs of a variety of sizes. Some are almost microscopic, and some, of course, you get up to like a big spruce beetle or something where you can really see it. And also, it's interesting on this particular food web that they haven't included earthworms, because earthworms are pretty important, but earthworms are in there too. Although, a point about earthworms is they're more native to grassland than forest land. So this far north, if you're finding earthworms in the soil, it's interesting because they're actually not from here. They can be really useful in a garden, but they can be a little disruptive if they get into like a pure forest ecosystem. And the reason is they change the structure of the soil a little bit, which affects the way the trees grow. It's interesting, down in the grassland around Saskatchewan, it's easier for me to be like, yeah, earthworms all over the place. And here it's sort of like, there maybe actually shouldn't be so many earthworms, but yeah. Okay, so just a little bit of the interesting stuff that these different guys do. I'm not going to go too deep into this because this isn't a soil lecture, it's a compost one, but I just get really excited, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it. One thing that bacteria do in soil, they eat the plant material and they break it down, and they store extra nitrogen in their body. And then when the bacteria are eaten by something, like in that first one there, we see some protozoa, the blobby white guy, eating some of those little bacteria. And it's sort of almost like, imagine that you went to eat a delicious sandwich, but it was too salty. And the protozoa have a thing where they can actually like spit out the extra salt, in this case that being nitrogen. It's not literally a salt, sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors a bit. But so there's more nitrogen in the bacteria than they need, so they'll eat the bacteria and then and spit out some extra nitrogen, and the plants can take that up. So it's this really interesting cycle that they go through. A couple cool kinds real quick. There's nitrogen fixers. These work with plants like legumes, and they are symbiotic. There was recently a movie came out with a symbiote. It was called Venom. But it's not always with weird goopy aliens. It's also just two species of creatures that work together in a way that benefits both of them. So with nitrogen fixers, it's a kind of bacteria, and they move in to plants' roots, and the plant gets along with bacteria gets along with the plant, and they help each other. And this kind can actually pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil. And then, should I pull this a little further away from my mouth? I feel like you're getting all of my breath noises. Sorry. Can you hear me okay? All right. So the other one that we've got over there, that word that looks impossible to pronounce, but I've learned it, it's actinomycetes. Actinomycetes, and it's a weird curly kind of bacteria, and the reason I think it's really interesting, partly is because it looks weird for a bacteria. They thought it was a fungus for a long time, and they were like, what is this? And they kept looking at it on slides until they could figure it out. But it's neat, because this is what's responsible for making soil smell like soil. You know that earthy smell that you get outside when the soil's a little damp? It's all these guys. They're making a compound called geosmin, and that's what smells like soil. And I just thought that was so neat when I found out. It's like the hidden workings behind the world that I've always experienced, but I didn't know about them. All right, and then we've got some fungus. So on the left, we've got a picture of the really obvious part of the fungus, the flowers that pop out, or the mushrooms, that would be, the fruiting body. Most of the fungus actually grows under the soil and inside of dead wood, though. It sort of has long threads called hyphae. On the right, we've got some plants. And this is the way that fungus form a symbiotic relationship with most plants, is they'll hook up with the roots and they'll bring nutrients and water from further away, and in return the roots will give them a little bit of extra sugar that they make from photosynthesis. So the one on the left there is some roots that don't have any symbiotic relationships with the fungus in the soil, and the one on the right is established plants that they and the fungus have made a connection, and now they bring things from further away. So these are some of the things that are going on in healthy soil, which obviously can't happen if it doesn't have fungus, if it doesn't have bacteria, if it doesn't have the organic matter for them to live on and live in. And larger things too are in there, like protozoa. These are the bigger things that eat the bacteria. They're still microscopic though. Nematodes, most of these are microscopic as well. They're usually like less than 1 millimeter long. And then we got arthropods, which is, of course, all the different little bugs. This is a close-up of some very tiny arthropods called springtails, which live basically everywhere in the world except for probably Antarctica. And they're very important too. And earthworms, finally. So all of these guys, their job is a variety of different kinds of eating organic matter, shredding organic matter, mixing it, aerating the soil. All of them being in the soil is really important for its long-term health. And luckily, compost adds all of them. Because what's actually in the compost is a mixture of organic material and living organisms, tiny ones. So, 1 teaspoon of healthy soil. I forgot I had this slide. 1 teaspoon of healthy soil can contain somewhere between 100 million and 1 billion bacteria, so that is a lot. And if you took all of the little fungus threads and put them end to end, there'd be a few meters of them. There might be somewhere between a few thousand and 1 million protozoa, a couple hundred nematodes, more here, more in forest style soils, so it might be a couple thousand nematodes, a few arthropods, tiny bugs, and if you put your spoon in the ground in just the right place, perhaps an earthworm. Yeah. And so the reason, beyond helping the ecosystem and biodiversity and the earth and sequestering carbon and all of those good things, the reason this is also specifically selfishly important to humans is that the organic matter in living creatures make the soil really good for growing plants. It gives them food and nutrients. It's a slow release of nutrients over time, rather than something like a Miracle-Gro or a chemical fertilizer, which is a sudden release of all the nutrients at once, and then a few weeks later you gotta add more. Organic matter keeps dishing it out for many, many years. It also helps the soil hang on to more water. The organic matter is real fluffy and it kind of acts like a sponge. So that means that when it rains, it soaks up all that water, and then if it's dry for a while, it still has the water it's hanging on to. It also makes soil looser and fluffier. If it's like hard-packed soil, it'll loosen it up. And it even makes plants more resistant to diseases, because having a robust ecosystem of organisms makes it harder for a disease to take hold. We say it's sort of like, if you can imagine the disease organism as some punk who's showing up in town, having the soil already be full of a healthy ecosystem is like he's showing up in this crowded neighborhood full of people, and there's not very much room to spread out. Whereas if it was all empty, all the buildings were empty, you could just multiply and take over the whole place. So having it be crowded with a variety of different organisms makes it harder for any disease to get a foothold. So these are all the reasons. I'm finally done talking about the why of compost. Now I can actually talk about how to do it. Thank you for listening so far. Okay, so the interesting thing about compost is we didn't really invent it. Obviously, as long as there has been plants and animals and other living organisms that have been born and grow and live and then die, they've had to have a way to break down back into organic matter again so they can keep cycling. So it still happens in the wild. Now, of course, nobody goes along and like scoops up all the pine needles and leaves and puts them in a compost bin and then puts them back in the forest again when they're done. That would be very silly. Home composting, or composting the way humans do it, is really just a way to speed it up and to get finished compost as quickly as possible. How do we do it? Well, so to make compost quickly, it's all about making the right mix so that the microbes, the bacteria and fungus that we like, can multiply and get to work. So I didn't specify before, but the picture on the left is some bacteria, a couple different kinds of bacteria under a microscope, and the picture on the right are some fungus threads, again called hyphae. So they're just these tiny, tiny little threads that grow through the soil, little chains. They're almost like tiny plant roots. And so we're just trying to make the right environment for these guys because they're the ones, the primary decomposers. They're the first ones that move into the organic matter and start breaking it up into smaller molecules. So, to make the good mix, yeah, didn't miss anything. This is the overview, and I'm going to talk about each of these things in turn. Basically, an outside compost pile is a 5-part recipe. And like two of these parts can be missing if necessary, but it will make things go a lot slower, or it might cause smell problems. So having all 5 of these means that it'll go as fast as possible, and it won't smell like anything bad. If anything, it'll just smell like some soil. So we've got green material, which is what we call sort of fresh food and plant waste that's got lots of nitrogen in it, and brown material, which is sort of older plant waste like wood and paper. So over there, I think the leaf jar and the paper jar would be brown material, and the food waste and the green plants would be the green material. And then air, we talked about how important that was and why. And moisture, to keep it all damp, as a damp sponge. And a little tiny bit of soil to get it started, because it's full of microbes. So, I'm going to go through them here. So, green material. Like I said, this is stuff that's rich in nitrogen, but like, we don't know the chemical composition of things just by looking at it. I can't look at this paper and be like, oh yes, this is 93% carbon, I can tell. But we do have a good rule of thumb is if something's kind of still fresh and green, it probably has a fair amount of nitrogen in it. And also pretty much all food waste goes into this category. So we're talking about things like green plants, weeds that we pull out of a garden, grass clippings. If we're dealing with somewhere that has livestock, then the manure from livestock that are plant eaters, like cows and goats and sheep and horses, is also really good to go in as green material, very rich in nitrogen. We tend to avoid the waste from animals that are either omnivores or carnivores, like dogs and cats and humans, because it can have the manure from those people and animals can have things in it that can make us sick, whereas with horses and cows and stuff, it's a lot less likely. Those things, human and cat and dog and carnivore waste can be composted, but it needs like sort of a special process to make sure it's safe. So we usually just tell people, don't do it at home. So we've got the plant material, we've maybe got manure, and then we got food waste. And with the food waste is generally anything from a plant is okay. So that includes obviously like vegetables and fruits. It also includes coffee and tea, the tea bags and the coffee grounds, because they're from plants as well. It can include things like pasta or bread or cereal that gets real old, as long as it's not got a lot of cheese and stuff or cream or things added to it, if it's just sort of the grain products. And it also includes eggshells. Eggshells are the one animal thing that's still fine to go in there. They almost just act like tiny rocks. They're kind of like pieces of limestone. So eggshells are great to add for calcium, but they rot real slow. All of this other stuff will be gone in a few months. The eggshells, you'll still see them at the end. They'll kind of just be around for like 10 years or more. They dissolve slowly. So anyway, we need about half of this fresh stuff. For those just joining us, we're just talking about how to make a compost pile that works really well. And so there's 5 things. We're just talking about the first one, which is nitrogen-rich material, which is basically food waste and green plants and maybe manure. So about half of the pile should be this. It says 40%, which is like a little less than half, but half is close enough. The reason we don't want to do only this stuff is if we put in only this fresh material, it gets kind of a bad smell. And the bad smell is about extra nitrogen escaping into the air as things like ammonia, and it just doesn't have a great smell, so we don't like that. So we tend to balance this stuff out. The other half should be carbon-rich material. So that's dead woody stuff like leaves or straw, sticks, wood chips, sawdust, paper, cardboard. Yeah, those are the main ones. I guess pine cones would also work. And so all of this dead woody stuff balances out the other things and makes it so they can break down with a really good balance of nitrogen and carbon, and they don't make a bad smell this way. The reason we don't do just this stuff, just this old woody stuff, is it breaks down really, really, really slow. On its own, it could take a decade or more to turn into soil. The reason for that is that nitrogen is kind of the fuel that makes compost go, but then we need some carbon to balance it out. That's basically it. So that again would be like the paper jar and the leaf jar that's up there. So normally we would assemble the two things in layers, kind of. So we'd add some food waste when we have it, and then we'd maybe put some leaves or some paper. Maybe it'll work very well. And also, as an extra bonus thing, whether it would count as like a fresh green material or like a woody brown material. So I'm gonna go through. Also, just in terms of that, like you can put in anything, but it's not always a good idea. When I started this job, I was like, I'm gonna experiment with things. And one of the things that I ended up putting in my compost bin just to see what would happen was it was small, but it was a whole wheel of cheese. Because one of my friends is like, I've had this wheel of cheese for like 2 years. Should I still eat it? And I was like, no, don't eat it. But it didn't go well. It had lots of weird bugs in it, and it smelled really bad. So don't put a wheel of cheese in your compost pile. That's the wonderful wisdom that you get from the professional here. Okay, so quiz time. Do people, I guess, are people okay with just like shouting out whether they think yes or no, or do you want to like put up a hand? What are people most comfortable with? I know it's early, it's morning, so we're probably all still a little bit asleep. I think I will get people to say it out loud, if that's okay. Do you guys think that fruit should go in the compost or shouldn't go in the compost? Should. Hand up if you think it should go in the compost. Awesome, yeah. And does anybody have a guess whether it's a green material or a brown material? Anyone think? You know? That fresh stuff or that old wood stuff? What do you think?
It's green material.
Okay, well there you go. Yes, and it is. You're right. Yes, it can go in the compost, and yes, it's green material. What about vegetables? Hands up if you think they go in. Yes, they do. And does anybody else think green or brown material? I agree. You're right. Okay. Leaves. Hands up. People think leaves go in? All right. Yep. And do people think it's a brown material or a green material? What do you think?
Brown.
Yes, you're right. Awesome. Okay. What about some meat? Here is a chicken. Hands up if you think it goes in. Yeah, no, it should not. And the reason is when we put in animal products like meat or grease or dairy, they make a strong smell that's both not nice for humans. We do not like the way it smells, but it does smell really good to animals, so we don't want to put that in because it'll attract them. So, nope. Coffee grounds. You guys know the drill. Hands up if you think it goes in. Yeah, it does. And it is a green material, as we talked about. Eggshells. Eggshells can go in. They're interesting. It's the one kind of animal thing that's all right to go in there. No, it's one of two animal things. We'll talk about the other one in a sec. And yeah, it's interesting. We kind of lump them in with the food waste, but they're really just calcium, so they're kind of their own thing. Butter. Nah, no butter. Cheese. Same thing. I just told you about that. Don't put in the cheese. It will not be good. Oil. No. Too greasy. So things that are greasy as well are not a super good idea to put in. Even if it is from a plant, it might be some canola or corn oil or something like that, but it's still greasy. Wood chips. Do people think they should go in? Yes, and they are a brown material. Treated wood. So it's a little hard to see here, but this wood is supposed to be sort of greenish because it's been pressure treated. And that actually means that it wouldn't be okay to go in. If wood's been like painted or varnished or pressure treated, then it's had chemicals added to it that we probably don't want in our finished compost. Nope. Paper towel. Hands up. Isn't it? Yeah, paper towel can go in. As we were talking about way earlier in the presentation, if we have paper or cardboard that's sort of well, if we have a recycling program, if clean stuff can go in there, but dirty stuff can still go in the compost. If we don't have a recycling program, then it can all go in the compost. So we got paper towel that could go in and it counts as a brown material. Grass clippings, hands up. Yep. Grass clippings can, green material. That one's nice because the color actually goes with what it is. Doesn't always happen. Like coffee grounds are brown, but they're a green material. So sometimes it's a little confusing. Weeds with seeds. This one's tricky. It's a maybe. Some people do and some people don't, because for a lot of our compost piles, they won't get hot enough to kill weed seeds. So if we put them in, then they'll sort of get planted when we put the compost out. But other people are like, yeah, but I don't want to have to worry about it, so I'm just going to put them in anyway and not care. So that's kind of where I'm at. I just don't worry about it, and then I pull the weeds up later. So that's a green material as well. Newspaper. Newspaper is a yes. And it counts as a brown material, as do all of the paper and cardboard things. And dog or cat waste. Not the kitten. Don't put a kitten in the compost. So again, this one is sort of a maybe in that technically it can be composted, but you have to be careful about the finished compost made with it because it could have things in it that make us sick. So the issue would be like if we composted all of our dog's waste and then we put that compost on some lettuce and then we ate the lettuce raw and then we might get sick. So it's basically if you want to make some compost with it and then just put it on like a tree or some flowers that you're not going to eat, it's fine. Bread that is real old bread. Hands up, hands down. What do you think? This one actually can. Bread is okay because it is mostly flour and flour is from a plant. It counts as a green material. If we were a bakery and we had like 2 big sacks of bread a day to compost, that might be too much, but just a little bit is okay. Tea bags, these ones are also a yes. I'm just going to speed up a little bit so we can keep going. And it's green material. The interesting thing is some tea bags are paper and some are plastic, and it's kind of hard to tell from looking. Again, because I'm sort of lackadaisical about this, I just put them all in, and then at the end, in the finished compost, if there's a little plastic tea bag, I'll just take it out again. It's not a big deal. This was the other weird one that I wanted to talk about. What do you guys think? I want to hear about this. Okay, I'm getting lots of no's, but actually you can put hair into the compost. Hair and fur, so if you have a fluffy dog or a fluffy cat, or if you're a fluffy human, you can put the hair into the compost and it will break down. It actually counts as a green material. So hair is high in nitrogen, the more you know. It makes people look at you weird though, when I take some hair from a hairbrush and put it in the compost. Alright, so that's the end of the quiz. Thank you. These are all things that can or can't go in the compost or can maybe go in the compost. So I'm going to go back to talking about the 5 things. We've talked about green material and brown material. There's 3 more, so I'm going to talk a little bit about extra soil. This is kind of optional. It's not necessary, but it makes it go a little better. So if you have a bit of soil or finished compost to add, it's a good idea. You don't need a lot, like a shovel or 2 in a whole compost bin is fine. And it just gives the compost a boost. It's like an accelerator, and the reason for that is, as we talked about earlier, healthy soil is full of microbes, and those microbes are the ones that do the work. So it's like putting yeast into bread dough. It also is something that helps, another thing that helps the compost not have any kind of a bad smell. Water, this one is incredibly simple. If compost isn't damp, it will not break down. Compost that is dry will just sit there and wait to become damp. It's not ruined or anything, it's just it won't do anything until it gets wet again. It doesn't have to be soaking wet, but it does need to be sort of like a wrung out sponge or a wrung out washcloth. So this guy is just adding a bucket of water to his pile of compost. In the summertime, this often means watering compost that's outside, like every couple of weeks. For people who are able to set up a rain barrel, that's a really nice way to do it, because then you've got free water that's just from the rain and you don't have to take it from like a well or a treated system. And the last one is some fresh air for the oxygen. We talked about how oxygen is what makes all the difference in having compost break down in a way that's clean and doesn't make methane. So stirring it up is one way. Sometimes people will use a special tool called an aerator to stir it because it's easier, especially when you have this kind of a small bin or like the one I have there. Or you could use a pipe that's got holes in it. Or you can just rely on the vents on the outside of the compost bin. So I'm going to do my best to duck under this cable here. Oh no! Well, what have I done? There we go. It's fine. So I just have examples for here. So in this kind of a small compost bin, it can be really helpful to have a little aerator tool of some kind rather than a shovel, because it can be really difficult to get a shovel or a pitchfork or potato fork or something into compost. It gets sort of stuck and you can't get it all the way down. Whereas something like this, it punches through the compost really easy because it's pointy. And then when it's coming up again, the wings flip down and it stirs it all up. So these are really helpful. Another option that some people do, especially if you're short on time, is they'll get a piece of pipe. You can't really buy these ready-made, you have to make them yourself. You'll get a piece of pipe from either from somebody who's doing some renovations or just from a hardware store, and drill some holes in it. Just about 1 centimeter holes and every few inches. And they would then just put it in the center of their compost bin like this. And they'd build their compost pile around it. And as they were building it, it would act as like a straw to get air to the center, or a chimney. So that's really good for people who don't want to spend a lot of time turning their compost. The edges of a compost will always get enough fresh air just from the air that's around it. It's the center of the pile that sometimes needs a little help. Oh, and one other option that I didn't have an example for, rather than the fancy aerator tool, sometimes people will just take something that's kind of heavy and pointy, like a piece of rebar or a metal pipe, and they'll just stick it down to the bottom of the compost and pull it out again a few times to make sort of little air holes into the bottom. Just punch little air holes into it. So all of these things can work. And some people choose to not stir it at all, which just makes it a little slower, and it may make a tiny bit of methane, but it's still okay. It's a lot faster if we stir it up. So if possible, it's really good to, during the warm part of the year, poke or stir the compost a little bit, maybe every 2 weeks or so. Same as the watering. Okay, so those are the 5 big things: is air, water, soil, green material, and brown material. But other things that will affect the compost is how big the pieces are. Little pieces break down faster than big pieces. This is like the difference between sawdust and wood chips, or wood chips and a whole tree in terms of how fast they'll rot. So things like coffee grounds are great for compost because they're already in these little tiny pieces. Then the size of the pile of compost will also affect how it breaks down. Turns out that big piles break down a lot faster than small piles. It's they don't get dried out so quickly, and they can hang on to more heat, and I'll talk about where that heat comes from. And they are more space for the bacteria and fungus to multiply in. And the last one is another thing that will affect how it breaks down is whether the pile is assembled all at once, like somebody stores up 2 or 3 tubs of food waste and 3 or 4 bags of paper or leaves, and then they mix them all together at once, or whether they're adding it a little bit at a time, like a little pail of food waste every few days as you have it. Most people are doing the second one, every, a little bit at a time, and that's because that's how we make the food waste, right? But if people want to make compost really, really fast, then they'll do the first one, where they get a whole bunch together at once and then they put it all together. So for that one, oftentimes people will maybe hit up some restaurants or a coffee shop or something and be like, hey, do you have bags of coffee grounds? And they'll get a whole bunch at once to get going. Because if it's all assembled at once, it breaks down faster. Specifically, those factors will affect whether the compost heats up or not. So this is a compost pile, an example of a compost pile that got real hot, so that's all steam coming off of it. And what happens here is that if a compost pile is really bacterially active, it'll heat itself up, because every single tiny bacteria makes a tiny bit of heat as it's eating, and so all of them together can make a lot of heat. A hot compost pile can get up to 50 or 60 or 70 degrees Celsius in the center, which would be hot enough to cook some eggs if you wanted to put them in there. But the nice thing about that hot temperature is A, it makes the compost break down real fast, and B, that's hot enough to kill weed seeds. And it's also hot enough to kill any bad bacteria that are in there. So if you can get your compost to get this hot, then it's safe to put in things like sewer waste or manure or stuff that could have salmonella or E. coli, because it'll kill it. And that's really cool. Mostly we don't get our home compost piles that hot, so we need to be careful not to add those scary kinds of waste that could have bad bacteria in them. But it is still just really neat. So compost that does go through this hot phase is it usually gets quite hot for a couple weeks, and then it cools off, and then it spends a couple months just at like ambient outdoor temperature. So it doesn't stay hot the whole time, but it has a little spike at the start. Any questions about that one before I keep going? All right, I'm going to continue. Avoiding animals. So, I gotta admit, this is harder for northern Saskatchewan than southern Saskatchewan, because in southern Saskatchewan, we're worried about mice and maybe skunks, possibly raccoons. In northern Saskatchewan, the issue is bears, which are like bigger and more of a problem than mice. And so it means if we want to compost food waste outside, anywhere in bear country, we have to be careful to have it be inside of a bin that is very sturdily built and has a lid that a bear can't open and is staked down to the ground so a bear can't swipe it over. And that is a little bit hard. If we just want to compost yard waste, it'll be fine, like just plants. But once we start putting food waste in, we do need to be careful if we're in a community where there are bears around. I have an example, a little tiny compost bin here. It's a 3-stall one, so this is one that would sort of have 3 different compartments for putting compost in. And this one has an example of wire sides. That wouldn't work in this case, but if it was wood all the way around and staked down, and then of course it would have a little lid, they could have a latch on it, then that should be able to do fine. The one in this image is also that way, in that if an animal was to approach it but not find a way to get in, it won't generally stick around or keep coming back. It's only if they're able to get into it, then they learn that it's a food place and they should continue returning. Okay. Actually, these are questions about that one before I keep going. I'm also going to talk about other ways to compost food waste indoors, which makes it easier if you wanted to have just plant waste outside and food waste inside. But, all right, winter time. It freezes. Next slide. No. Okay, so in the winter time, the compost gets really cold and it turns into a popsicle. You can keep adding stuff. You can keep adding food scraps or plants over the winter if you have them, if you want to. But it will just freeze. It won't break down until the spring. There are a lot of composting textbooks that were written in places like Florida, and they're like, yeah, in winter when it gets down to like 10 degrees Celsius at the coldest, maybe your compost will slow down a little. And here it's like, yeah, it's minus 40, thanks very much. So it won't stay composting in the wintertime. It will just freeze, which means that it might take up a little more space in the winter. And the reason for that is that instead of shrinking and decomposing, everything is just going to freeze in the shape that it is. So sometimes people's compost bins can get pretty full by the end of the winter time if they're still adding their food scraps. But when it warms up in spring, it all settles a whole bunch right away, and then you have a bunch more room. When is it done? It's done when it looks like soil is the shorthand, but like to be a little more specific, it should be dark brown or black or light brown. Any of that spectrum is okay. It should feel crumbly, and it should smell like earth. It shouldn't have any kind of a sour smell at this point. Everything's soft, like food waste, like vegetable peels and fruit peels, and green plants shouldn't be recognizable anymore, but some tough stuff will still be visible. Like if you put in wood chips, there'll still be some half broken down wood chips in there, avocado pits, peach pits, corn cobs, and eggshells. All of these things we'd expect to see them in the finished compost. So they're not a sign that it's not done, it's just sort of, they take longer, and it's fine to still take that stuff and put it out into a space for growing or mix it into a pot for growing. Some people who really want it to look like the nice stuff that they get from the store, they'll put it through a little sieve made of like wire first to take out all the chunks, but it's just aesthetic. It's only to make it pretty. It doesn't like make it work better. So most people then would take some finished compost 1, maybe 2 times a year. In the fall after the plants are done, or in the spring before the plants are in, it works the best. Yeah. So here's a little bit of finished compost someone has, and you can see that there's still sort of woody bits in it, but most of it is broken down. And then I used to have a whole complicated slide that was like, you can use it specifically this way or that way, and then I realized it's just literally any way that you put the compost back into soil works. On soil, in the soil, in a hole, on top, in a potted plant, on a lawn, it doesn't matter as long as you just put it back into contact with soil and plants. Okay, so other options, real quick. We're at about 10 o'clock here, that's good, we're right on time. Trench compost is when we take food waste mostly, and maybe green plants, and we simply dig a hole and bury it. And that actually works quite well too, although again, if we're in a place where we're worried about animals, we'd have to be aware that unless it was very far down, like under a couple feet of dirt, it would probably still smell good to something with a real good nose, like a bear. And so this would probably only be an option if we were somewhere where the bears were not a big issue. Here it's uncovered, but what you would actually do is you dig the trench, you put the food waste in, and then you would immediately put several inches of soil on top of it. And then the soil microbes would get to work breaking it down right there. There's also enough air in soil that it still has the fresh air it needs to break down without methane. Option number 2 is to, I forgot to do a video before. Well, I'll do it at the end. Option number 2 is to use number 3, I guess this is, to use a vermicompost bin, which is an indoor bin, which uses a captive population of red wiggler earthworms, a specific kind of earthworms, to break down food waste into compost. So that's what a picture is here. I also brought my own, and we're going to be spending some of the last half hour talking about that. I'm going to come back to it and just skip ahead. And one final way to mention is something called bokashi fermentation. Some people do this, and this is an interesting and really weird form of composting because it's a 2-step process. And the first step, which you can see on the left there, is actually fermenting the food waste inside of a sealed container. So after this person was finished packing it down, they would put a lid back on and it would be airtight. So the reason it's so weird is the first step is specifically about keeping fresh air out, which is no other part of composting is like that. And you also have to add a special thing called bokashi bran, which is just wheat bran, but it's been inoculated with a specific blend of fungus and microbes. So this is like a fermentation thing. I tell people it's sort of like making the world's grossest bucket of sauerkraut. And then once it's done fermenting, then they would open it up and bury it in the ground or put it in a regular compost bin. So why would people go to the extra work of this extra step if they still have to trench compost it or put it in a compost bin? The reason is, one, it breaks down much faster. Once it's actually out in the compost, this stuff breaks down in a couple of weeks. Between 2 to 6 weeks instead of like 3 to 6 or 3 to 9 months. And the other thing is that, at least in theory, and it's been working so far for me, I've been experimenting with it, you can put meat and bones and cheese and cream and all the things you normally can't into a bokashi bucket, and it makes them safe to go in the compost bin. So that's quite interesting. And it does seem to work. Two little downsides for it, like the positives are it breaks down quick and you can put in all of your food waste. 2 little downsides, one is it's a little bit fussier, and it does rely on a product that you have to buy, that bokashi brand. And the second is the food waste itself, once it's fermented, you won't notice when the lid's on tight, but when you're opening it up, it smells a little bit. It smells kind of like somewhere between apple cider vinegar and beer, but it's got like a sour smell, which makes sense because it's fermenting. So some people do this and they love it. Other people are like, I tried it, I hated it, I'm never doing it again. So it's sort of a mix between the people who like it and the people who don't. Okay, but back to that vermicompost. I am going to show a video. Could we turn up the volume again? So for those of us just joining, we have a silly workaround for sound here. Just give me a second. So these videos that I'm about to show, I have 2 of them, but there's a total of 7. They're all on YouTube, and they're under the title of Composting in 60 Seconds, and they're all 1-ish minute videos that talk about different aspects of composting. So they're really good for like a quick introduction, or like, wait, I don't quite remember how that works, and then you go back and it just gives you a reminder.
Using red wiggler earthworms. To get started, get a plastic storage tub and put some holes in the lid. Shred some newspaper or cardboard for bedding. Dampen it with water and add a handful of soil. Next you'll need some red wiggler worms. These aren't the same species as the earthworms in prairie gardens, so you'll have to get them from a local vermicompost supplier. Feed the worms plant-based kitchen scraps and eggshells. Avoid meat, greasy food, and Always bury the food underneath the bedding. Add more dry bedding as you need it. If they aren't fully covered, food scraps can sometimes attract fruit flies. You can make a fly trap with apple cider vinegar and dish soap. One way to harvest the compost is to only feed one side of the bin for a few weeks, then scoop out the other side to use. You can also spread the compost under a bright light and wait 30 minutes. The worms will move to the bottom and you can skim good compost off the top. Repeat this a few times, then return the worms to a fresh bin. The compost is great for plants. It's okay if there are still a few worms in it. For more information, go to swrc.ca/compost.
No. Stop. So that is one of the videos that's available on YouTube, and you can tell that we were low budget and couldn't afford actors because I'm in some of them. But also, the one that I meant to show earlier was a quick overview of the 5 things that work to make a home outdoor compost bin work really well. So I am going to show that one as well, just because it's a really good summary. Windows everywhere. There we go.
You can turn food and yard waste into quality compost in 5 easy steps. First, you need some carbon-rich material like dry leaves or dead plants. These should make up about half of what you add to your compost bin each time. The second half should be nitrogen-rich material like grass, fresh plants, or kitchen scraps. Avoid meat, greasy food, and milk products. Fruits, vegetables, grain products, and eggshells are okay. Mix in a shovel of soil every couple of weeks to help get the process going. Add more kitchen scraps and yard waste as often as you need to, making sure to balance brown material and green material each time. Keep the compost damp by adding water when it starts to dry out. You can use rainwater if you have a rain barrel. Mix the materials together. Keep fresh air in the pile by stirring it up every couple of weeks. You can also use a pipe with holes in it. With a little care, you'll have finished compost in 2 to 6 months. The stuff on the bottom will finish first. For more information, go to swrc.ca/compost.
Thanks for putting up with our little workaround for the sound system there. We were in a rush setting up this morning and couldn't quite figure out how to make our cables work. So those are available online and they're good little summaries to check out. There's also one on using finished compost, there's one on picking a compost bin, there's one on what to do in winter, there's one on bokashi composting, and there's, did I say one for finished compost? Trench compost. There's one on trench compost. Yes. So those are the 7. We made them 2 years ago now, and they're pretty cool. I'm gonna bring my PowerPoint back up, although it's actually the last slide here. So if people have more information, I would definitely recommend those YouTube videos or this website, which is the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council. That's what SWRC stands for, /compost, which has more information on a million different kinds of composting. Or you could even contact, this is a volunteer group that I coordinate, the Saskatoon Compost Coaches. We have a phone number, an email, a Facebook, and we just answer compost questions for people. But I am going to talk a little bit more now about vermicompost here. So the video did a quick overview of, my notes are in the vermicompost. I don't want those to turn into vermicompost. We did do a quick overview in the video about sort of how it works. So the earthworms that are in here, which are the ones that are actually changing the food waste, they eat it and they make worm poop or worm castings. Every time that I say that to a class of grade 3s, then everybody breaks out and giggles for like 10 minutes and I can't get the group back together. But it's a lot easier in high school. So the worm poop isn't smelly the way it would be for an animal. It's basically just soil. In fact, soil that is outside in much of the world is also basically worm poop. Secret of the world. They aren't the exact same variety of earthworm as what people in a grassland would generally find. Like if you were digging in the soil around PA or Saskatoon, the kind of earthworm you would find isn't the same as these guys. I say it's the same as how like when you have dogs, you have poodles and huskies and chihuahuas and Great Danes, just a million kinds of dogs. There's a million kinds of earthworms in the world too. And this type is called red wiggler earthworms. I'm just gonna get one out My guys are a little mad at me right now because I let it get too wet in here. We'll talk about that later. I put it outside and it got snow in it, and they did not like that. So they're all kind of freaking out and near the top, whereas normally they'd be a little more calm and a little more mixed in. So, oh, come on. You gotta cooperate with me. I gotta pull one of you out to show people. Oh, slimy. Yes, there we go. Come here. Don't want to hurt him either, so that's why I'm trying to be careful. Get off. There. So there's just one, and you can see they're real small. Like compared to the earthworms that would normally be in the ground around Saskatoon, they're a lot bigger. So this guy's real small, but he's a red wiggler earthworm, and tiny bit of trivia, biggest kind of earthworm in the world. I don't know the name of it, but the biggest kind of earthworm in the world lives in the rainforests of Brazil and gets up to 2 meters long. So these are a lot smaller than that also. Anyway, it's easy to remember the name of red wiggler earthworms because they're red in color and they wiggle. It's pretty simple. They're eating machines. So when they are happy, they will eat about between half and their full weight in food waste in a day, each of the worms will, and change it into castings. What else was I going to say about them? To get started, yeah, because they're not native to here, you basically have to buy some from someone, or if you know somebody who already does vermicompost, their worm populations will increase over time, and they should have enough to give away, like a seed population, every few months. And I did bring some here for Melissa, and hopefully they prosper for her, so I'm sure she could give some away. I also have a list of people in Saskatchewan who sell them. The only difficulty there is that a lot of people used to ship them by bus, and now we don't have a bus, so it's a little harder to get them. But there is at least somebody selling them in Prince Albert, and then 3 people selling them in Saskatoon, and then I believe 1 in Regina. Oh no, the Prince Albert one isn't on there. Okay, I'll have to send it by email to people if they want it afterwards. Those are out of date. Oops. And so to get a bin started, pieces. I'm just gonna close this. There are like fancy pre-made compost bins for this that you can buy sometimes at gardening or sort of hippie health food stores if they're around. But generally, we just start with a tub, simple little Rubbermaid tub. This is about the right size. You don't want it to be too deep because we want to make sure that it doesn't build up really deep and get it so there's no air in the bottom. So these are shallow enough that it can still get fresh air. This is Melissa's bin actually. And then we usually put some holes in the lid. If anybody's ever kept a caterpillar or a grasshopper or anything in a jar, you know you gotta put some holes in the lid so they can breathe. Oftentimes also, like you can see I don't have the lid on mine right now, and honestly if you don't want to bother putting holes in the lid, you could also just, rather than closing it, you could just kind of put the lid on like that all the time so it's a little bit open and can get some air. Some people put holes in the bottom so extra liquid can drain out. You can do that, then you have to have like it nested inside of another tub like this to catch the drips. I don't usually do that because I like being able to take mine anywhere and easily put it down on carpet or a desk or wherever I want without it leaving drips behind. But no holes in the bottom does mean I need to be more careful about water in mine, so that's why they're angry about the snow water right now. And then, to get started, we would give them some bedding. So worms need some carbon-rich bedding to live in. If you had a hamster, you'd give them some little wood shavings or something, but with worms we usually give them newspaper. Newspaper's the best if you can get it. If you can't get newspaper, office paper will do, although it's not their favorite. Even cardboard would be better than this, like a torn up or cut up cereal box or something like that would do better than this kind of paper, but we'd put in some of that. The nice thing about newspaper, if that's our choice, it's getting harder and harder to find newspaper these days, but if you can find newspaper, is that it tears in one direction really easily, so it's really easy to shred it by hand. Because if you try to tear it the other way, it gets really weird and ripped, but in one direction it always tears straight. So it's really easy to shred some newspaper. Another thing that, oh, where is it? Where is it? Where has it gone? There it is. Another thing that's good to add just at the start is to put in a little bit of regular soil. And the reason we would add a little bit of regular soil in is that earthworms do not have any teeth. And the way that they eat is similar to the way a bird eats. They have something called a gizzard, which is like a little extra stomach that they put some tiny rocks in, and then they use the little stomach full of rocks to grind up their food. And so chickens will peck up tiny pebbles for their gizzard. Earthworms need something a lot smaller, so they'll go for the rock dust that's in regular soil. And the reason we put in a bit of soil is that there just isn't a lot of rock dust in newspaper, so it's hard for them to find stuff to chew. Another thing some people will do will just be they'll take some eggshells and they'll crush them up real good with a rolling pin, and they'll put that in, and they'll use that for some grit. So after this, after we have bedding and soil, I'm not setting it up for real right now because I've got 3 more groups to do after this. We would need some earthworms. Oh, no, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. We would need some water. So the first time that we're setting up a bin, we need to make sure that the newspaper is damp. Not too wet, but damp. So it'd be easier, it would be better to err on the side of a little bit too dry than too wet. Because if anybody has seen, I don't know, does it happen around here? If it rains here, do you get earthworms on the sidewalk? Yeah? Okay, yeah, they do the same thing in here where they don't like being too wet. So we would add just a tiny bit of water at a time and mix it around until our newspaper was damp. And then we would put in our worms. So these are the ones that I have brought with me from Saskatchewan to give to Melissa. And this is oftentimes how worm dealers will sell them. They'll put them in a jug. And so this is, it's not solid worms in here, of course. It's a mixture of mostly vermicompost castings, the worm poop, and some of the bedding. And then the worms are down in there hiding. And so we would put this in and put some paper over them, and they'd be in their new home. And then we could just start feeding them kitchen waste, or food scraps. So what we would usually do for the food scraps is we might mark like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 around the bin. And the first time that we bury from food scraps, we'd move the bedding aside, dig a little hole in the castings, and we'd put our food scraps in there and then cover them up again. The reason we always need to cover them up thoroughly is so they don't get fruit flies. Fruit flies are a huge pain, and we don't like them. And then the next time you put it in the 2 spot, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and by the time you get back to number 1, if you notice that there is still a lot of unbroken down food waste there, that means that the worms aren't keeping up, and you've got to slow down with the feeding for a little bit. Because the amount that the worms eat isn't based on how big the bin is, it's based on how many worms you have and how hungry they are. So a lot of times, especially when you're getting started, the population of worms won't be that big, and they'll sort of ramp up how much they can eat over time. They're so angry at me. Sorry, you start to personify them after you've had them for a while, and I'm looking at them and they're just like, what have you done to us? Ah! So that's how to get started. It's not too difficult. This usually, it's not too expensive, like $10, $15 at a lot of stores. The newspaper and the soil should be free, and then an order of earthworms might be about $40, but you'd only have to get it once, and you would never have to buy it again, because they'll just multiply after that. Unless something really very bad happens, but I suppose that's always a possibility. They're quite resilient. The only thing I've ever heard of that has totally killed them is I knew somebody who put in some wood waste that they thought was untreated, but it turned out it actually had a fair amount of chemicals on it, and unfortunately that killed their worms. And I know someone else, I don't know them personally, but they called for help about their compost bin, and I don't know how they did this, but there was literally like 3 inches of standing water in their compost bin, so their worms drowned. I think they must have been adding like watering the bin like you would a plant, maybe? I don't know, but they shouldn't have done that.
I was going to say, my summer worm babysitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Watered it?
No, I don't think she watered it.
Okay.
I think it was a lot of nitrogen-rich material and not enough paper.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the other thing is...
I got it back with that much water, and within a couple of weeks, they were all...
That's unfortunate.
They were trying to get out.
Oh, yeah, yeah. If you, that's one thing. If the worms are happy, they will stay put in the bin. And in fact, mine are kind of grumpy right now, but they're still staying put. They're not trying to get out. If they're very unhappy with the bin conditions, often because of lots and lots of water, or because of, say, lots and lots of acid from lemons or oranges or something poisonous, like that wood my friend put in, then they might try to crawl out. Try to crawl out of the bin. So if you see a whole bunch of worms trying to get out, not 2 or 3. If it's 2 or 3, they're just lost. But if there's a whole bunch of them trying to get out, it means there's something in there that's hurting them. The good news is they can't like infest your house or something. It's good news for you, it's bad news for the worms. If a worm escapes the bin, they don't make it very far.
They get about this far.
They get about this far and then they dry up and die. So like what you'll find is a dead worm, like a couple feet away. Be like, oh, sorry, that was a bad choice. You shouldn't have left the bin.
Luckily, I'd already made a second bin.
Oh yeah,
One
so
was
there you go.
catastrophic.
And so you highlighted one thing is mostly we're feeding them more kitchen scraps, but every now and again, like maybe every week or every couple weeks, we need to give them more paper to balance it out. We usually just put the paper on top. If you notice that the bin is a lot too wet, like mine is too wet right now because it got melted snow water in there, what I'll probably do after this session is I'll gently mix the paper I have in there in so it'll soak up more water, and then I'll put more dry bedding on top. So I am going to bring this around to show people. I have to ask you a question though. Who feels really good about seeing a bunch of earthworms, and who is like, no, I would not like to look at all those earthworms? Because if you don't want to look real close at these earthworms, feel free to stay at your desk, but if you want to have a close look, you can come up to this table.
I have subjective notions to it. My kids anyway.
Oh, I'll grab these. Oh no, does nobody want to see the earthworms?
I'll go check it out.
Okay, so you can see mostly paper. You can't usually see the worms too much because they don't bite. But like I said, at the moment they're kind of mad at me. So there's a whole bunch of them bunched up right there. That's more of them than you would normally see in a clump. But so they're all just kind of like being like, that's too wet, what have you done? Ah! So I'm gonna give those guys some dry paper and maybe go over here, look for some that are a little calmer. There's not a lot in my bin right now because I recently harvested most of the compost out. I did the method where you put some plastic down and you dump the whole bin and you shine a bright light on it and you wait a while and the worms hide from the light and then you dig some out. So that's an onion skin. Sorry. I'm gonna see if I can find some interesting things like a baby or an egg to show you guys. Oh man. Okay. I'm just inured to this because I've done this for so long, it's not gross to me anymore. Also, I know that there's nothing in here that'll make me sick. It's just kind of like physically gross. It's not like you're gonna get sick gross. Okay, so on my thumb, I have separated out a baby. So this little tiny baby earthworm is probably hatched from an egg sometime in the last 24 hours. That is what they look like when they are newborn. So you can see it's very small and not red yet. They're still little and clear at this point. So that's how I know how young it is. Within about a couple days they turn red. What they do is they lay cocoons. Normally if this bin was more filled with castings, it would be easier to find a cocoon. As it is, I'm not sure I'll be able to. Also, yeah, sorry, it looks grosser right now than it normally would. I feel kind of guilty. Normally I try to make it real pretty before I bring it to a show, and this time I just forgot. So it's kind of gross looking. Yeah, so I won't dig too much then, I'll just keep it covered up. And it's also, like you noticed, it has a bit of a smell right now. It shouldn't have that normally, it's all because it's too wet. Yeah, oh man, it's stopping in here. I gotta add more paper.
The more it's going to smell.
Sorry, yeah, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna cover it up. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about it. So the worms themselves are, they aren't girls or boys, they're both genders. They're all girls and boys, so any one of them can lay a cocoon and have babies, which is part of the reason that they multiply so quickly. And then a cocoon, it looks about the size of a grain of rice, and it's round, and it's somewhere between yellow to orange to red. And after about 4 to 6 weeks, it will hatch into several of those little tiny white babies. They'll take about 60 days to get full size, and when they're full size, well, I mean, they're eating the whole time, but once they're full size, then they're big enough to have babies of their own. And so they do multiply very fast, which is why every 3 months or so, people could probably give some away to start someone else's bin. Yeah, in between this session and the next session, I'm gonna stir it up. Sorry, you guys got to see it when it was real ugly. And also when it was smelly, I feel real bad about that. But it's real simple, and the number of worms you have and how fast they're eating determines how quickly it fills with castings. Once it's getting pretty full and it's a little hard to find space to put more food waste in, that's when it's time to harvest. Or if you're just impatient and want some castings now, the nice thing about the compost that you get from this, the fine black compost, is it's both a finer mix than compost that you would make outside, and it's also more concentrated. So with outdoor compost, we say you can mix it up to like half-half with soil. With this stuff, we wouldn't go more than 10% because it is just real strong. Plants really like it though, even compared to like regular outdoor compost. And so it is a good way to deal with food waste. Oh, and if people want, pass this around, I have a fact sheet on vermicompost and also a list of suppliers. Well, this doesn't have the Prince Albert lady on it. So you can also find information on where to get it, this stuff, on our website, on the SWRC website. Right, I closed my computer, that's what's going on. And there's information there. So I might pass a few of these around, just take one if you're interested. No need, don't feel obligated to take it if you don't want it. And at this point, we've got like 5 minutes left. I just want to ask people if there are any questions. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here with me first thing in the morning. And I guess you guys were here yesterday, most of you, and you're probably going to be here tomorrow as well. So I hope the whole rest of the conference goes really well for people.